to the Delingpole with me, James Delingpole. And I know I always say I'm excited about this week's special guest. But before we meet him, let's have a word from one of our sponsors.
Global warming is a massive con. There is no evidence whatsoever that man-made climate change is a problem that is going to kill us, that we need to amend our lifestyle in order to deal with it. It's a non-existent problem. But how do you explain this stuff to your normie friends? Well, I've just brought out the revised edition of my 2012 classic book, Watermelons, which captures the story of how some really nasty people decided to invent the global warming scare in order to fleece you, to take away your freedoms, to take away your land. It's a shocking story. I wrote it, as I say, in 2011 actually. The first edition came out, and it's a snapshot of a particular era, the era when the people behind the climate change scam got caught red-handed, tinkering with the data, torturing till it screamed, in a scandal that I helped christen ClimateGate. So I give you the background to the skullduggery that went on in these seats of learning where these supposed experts were informing us, we've got to act now. I rumbled their scam. I then asked the question, okay, if it is a scam, who's doing this and why? It's a good story. I've kept the original book pretty much as is, but I've written two new chapters, one at the beginning and one at the end, explaining how it's even worse than we thought. I think it still stands up. I think it's a good read. Obviously I'm biased, but I'd recommend it. You can buy it from jamesdelingpole.co.uk/shop. You'll probably find it. Just go to my website and look for it, jamesdelingpole.co.uk. And I hope it helps keep you informed and gives you the material you need to bring round all those people who are still persuaded that, oh, it's a disaster, we must amend our ways and appease the gods, appease Mother Gaia. No, we don't. It's a scam.
Welcome to the Delingpole, Simon Dixon. I've been really, I know I always say this about my special guests, but I've been really looking forward to having you on. And I've been trying to get you for some time. And I think you're quite popular. I follow you on Twitter, and you generally say some pretty, punchy things, which I like. But before we talk about the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex, because I'm dying to know what the story is on them. Just tell me a bit about yourself, your background, how you came to doing all this.
Yeah, sure. I always tell my origin story where it started, which was 25 years ago, actually 26 years ago now, when my father lost everything he'd earned his entire life for in the dot-com boom and bust. And it was such a traumatic experience. And I was 19 years old at the time, that he asked me, son, what happened to my money? And ever since then, I've done nothing but very unhealthily obsess over finance. So the first thing I tried to do was get a job at the firm that he lost all his money from, which was a stockbroker called TD Waterhouse. And then I worked as a market maker on the London Stock Exchange. Then I worked in investment banking, taking companies public. And when I figured out how the game worked, I left in 2006. And I was trying to change bank, and I joined the banking reform movements at this stage that were available. And that kind of drove you into a lot of the gold bugs and people that were discussing how money works, and the Austrian School of Economics and various other things. But I realized that actually all the politicians are bought by bankers. And I also realized that the people that were investigating the financial crisis that came were the same people that came from the institutions that created the financial crisis. And so I realized that there's no banking reform, there's no political solution. what they teach you in economics is sponsored by banks. When you work in the system, you understand that no one really understands the entire cog. And so I tried to actually create a bank. We applied for a banking license with the Bank of England to create a non-fractional reserve bank. And they told us to apply, you need to put $60 million in the Bank of England. Then you can't build a non-fractional reserve bank. You have to build it on top of an existing bank that already clears into our system. And so then basically you couldn't build it. It was impossible to build a sustainable, what I considered a sustainable bank. And so that kind of left me in an air of hopelessness. And it was at that moment when I was invited to speak at the first Bitcoin conference in Europe when Bitcoin was about $3. And I wrote a book called Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. We pivoted the company, the bank that we couldn't get a banking license for. And we ended up investing in many, many fintech companies and many of the largest Bitcoin companies, over 100 of them. As Bitcoin succeeded, we went through this whole journey really of discovering that the only way to change the banking system is actually to leave it as it is, exit, and leave it to implode. And so that kind of brings us where we are right now, where I'm writing my next book on this concept of everything I've learned from the last 26 years and how this financial industrial complex works. Because over that whole journey, I was working with presidents like Bukele on the Bitcoin strategic reserves and Bitcoin bonds. I got chased out of the UK by Boris Johnson and the Bank of England.
What do you mean you got chased out by Boris?
Yeah, I mean, he invited me to discuss how, what types of financial innovation could be used in the UK. And I shared that the concepts of equity crowdfunding and various other things. And he liked the concepts. But then I told him about like Bitcoin and talked about a Bitcoin strategy of how you can do it without the banks. And from that moment, the FCA contacted us. The company was called Bank to the Future. He said he loved the name, and he launched a campaign around how to fund businesses called Bust to the Future. And then suddenly our license was pulled into question. And so I ended up moving to Hong Kong and reincorporating the company with foreign regulators. And never returned to the UK since. One of the things I did actually was supporting the Isle of Man in making Bitcoin legal tender, and the government actually did it. But just as the implementation phase came, they started updating the laws, and then the Bank of England contacted the government and said, if you do this, then we're going to remove the clearing to all of your banks on the entire island. And so they weaponized the Manx pound through its clearing into the Bank of England in order to make sure that none of it actually happens. So really, for 26 years, I've been in a battle against the banks, and now I just sit outside the system to the degree that's possible and try and help people become more and more sovereign and free from the forces that bankrupted my father, really.
So this is a cheeky question, but I mean, are you worth squillions?
I don't disclose my net worth, but
No,
if you look back at my YouTube channel, the very first presentation I gave at that Bitcoin conference, I've been telling people to buy Bitcoin every single month, regardless of price, and Bitcoin was $3 at that, and I still follow this advice to this day.
Oh, what is it worth today? About, is it 60,000, something like that?
Yeah, so the all-time high is $125,000, and it's now at about $63,000 last time I checked.
And is it going to, in your view, going to go much higher than $120,000?
I really don't like to say that, but the properties of Bitcoin are properties that I believe in. There's a fixed supply. There's only ever going to be 21 million of them. And every single year, ever since I've been involved, people discover new reasons why they need to own their own money without a bank in the middle that can censor your trend. They discover more and more reasons why they need to be able to spend money peer to peer without a government telling you how you can spend your money. And they become more and more reasons why they understand the value of a fixed supply asset, that no one can change a monetary policy and there's no central banker or centralized authority. My thesis is that every year that becomes more and more useful. But the price is determined by how many people want to buy it versus how many want to sell. And that changes all the time.
So I don't want this to be an incredibly involved Bitcoin conversation, because I think we've got more interesting stuff to talk about. But are you not of the view, well, you're obviously not of the view that Bitcoin was always created by the same people we're railing against in the banking system, and that they've got a backdoor, that somehow they can rig that one too, and it's all part of this transition to CBDCs, etc., etc.?
Both, actually. So I have a nuanced view. I do believe that the predecessor to Bitcoin was DigiCash, and that tried to create private currency on top of the banking system. It was shut down. It was founded by a guy called David Chom. If you look at David Chom, he was a teacher around cryptography in Netherlands. And one of his students was a guy called Len Sassaman, who I believe to be Satoshi Nakamoto. And Len Sassaman was committed suicide 1 month after the first developer went to meet with the CIA, Gavin Andresen. I believe that Bitcoin was a breakaway project from what's being built today. That the goal was to follow the work of DigiCash, which was shut down because the banks were able to shut it down, and build stable coins and central bank digital currencies. And Len Sassaman, who I believe to be Satoshi Nakamoto, that's my opinion, I couldn't prove it, released a white paper that showed how you can make it fully decentralized, where you have miners that are that can be anywhere in the world, that can mine the new supply. You have open source code where any developer can contribute to the code in an open source project. And you have the rules being enforced by nodes, where anyone can run a node and enforce the rules. And if you ever want to change a rule, you have to submit an open source contribution. The miners then need to mine it, and the nodes enforce the code. That's impossible to have a backdoor when you understand the architecture. And so I believe that Bitcoin was a breakaway from what they are building today, which is the digital surveillance grid, which is stable coins and central bank digital currencies. And Bitcoin get that exit. And if you look at everything that's happening today, they're really trying to centralize as much of that Bitcoin as possible in Wall Street wrappers, because they don't want you to own it in self-custody the way that Bitcoin was originally designed. They want to hold it for you, because they want to do to Bitcoin what they attempted to do to gold, which is create a paper version of it, so that they can manipulate the short-term price. That implies to me that Bitcoin in self-custody, used the way it was originally designed, was not something they wanted. And that's why I believe it was a breakaway project, and why it was released as a white paper.
And that's why Wasserman committed suicide.
Well, I don't wish to say that, because he does have living family today, and his family denies that he's Satoshi. I just find the sequence of events to be the most compelling case. And I've spent, I got involved in Bitcoin in 2011. So I spent 15 years and invested in 100 companies in the sector, and met many of the early developers at a squat at an old street in London when it first came around. And to me, it's the most logical story, but I can't prove it.
Yeah, I was quite. I mean, I got into Bitcoin when it was about $300. So I can't make the $3 boast, and I got into it because I wanted to be able to buy weed off the off the dark web. I think a lot of the early adopters of Bitcoin came into it that way.
Yeah, so Silk Road was really the first use case that got adoption. And Silk Road, there were a couple of use cases that got the early adoption, which is where Bitcoin gets its reputation. When you create money you can own, money you can spend, then all the use cases where censorship exists the most is where people tended to use it in the early days, which was buy things that government says you're not allowed to buy online, which was Silk Road. And also Satoshi Dice was one of the early use cases where you could trace on a blockchain whether the gambling site was rigging the game. And so you could have transparency in terms of the odds. And you could basically play poker and gamble with Bitcoin in a way that made it transparent whether they were rigging the game. So these were like the early cases. Interestingly, the founder of Silk Road, Ross Ulbright, he was recently pardoned as one of the first things that the Trump administration did. It's a very interesting full circular story that we're witnessing right now with some of these early use cases.
I always felt very sorry for Ross. Is that how you pronounce it? Albright.
Ross Ulbright, yeah.
I always felt very sorry for him, but was my sympathy misplaced? I mean, is he a goodie, or is he secretly another part of their system?
Pick your flavor, really. Some people believe that he was a freedom fighter, a libertarian, and people spent their life trying to help him get out of prison, which he achieved. Others would say he was in America while launching the Silk Road, and he was located right next to the FBI head office. And so whether it was a honeypot, in Bitcoin, we're a very skeptical community because we study how the system works. And we've been constantly under attack by intelligence agencies and infiltration operations. And so people will have different theories, and I don't have evidence either way. I think if you live in a country like America, it's a bit stupid to break the law and be next to the feds and be in a position where, it's quite a suspicious story, put it that way. But either way, I can only speculate.
Yeah. You mentioned the Bank of England earlier on. I suppose that's as good a way as any to start. Who owns the Bank of England? I mean, it's not us, the people, is it? It's not the British people.
Well, actually, so it was created in 1694 when William Paterson, a private bank, wanted to lend money to King Charles. And the collateral that was used to form the Bank of England was created out of thin air, and it was rehypothecated, and it was a £1.2 million loan. Really, it was a mechanism for allowing for the funding of war. So there was a very nice, cozy relationship between the Bank of England, the British East India Company, and the government, the Crown. That was that the government needed money for funding war without going to the people and trying to issue bonds, because it's very unpopular to go to war and people think it's a waste of money. And so it's very hard to raise finance when you disclose the war that you want to go to. Plus, much of it was for mercantilism, to steal other people's gold or wage opium wars and get Chinese addicted to opium, or facilitate transatlantic slave trade, or steal India's gold and pretend you were exporting tea when you were exporting drugs. These things aren't very popular. And so you need a private company to do that, which was the British East India Company. And the Bank of England was the mechanism for obfuscating how people were losing value in their currency. And they could raise finance for the war, and then it could leave the debt on the government, but transfer the wealth over to the British East India Company. And so it was a modern form of what we have today, socializing losses and privatizing gains without the people knowing that there's this very elaborate money laundering scheme happening through these institutions. Now, over time, under Gordon Brown, it was actually nationalized. But there was also another company, if you look up on Companies House, called the Bank of England Nominees Limited. I can't quite remember. It's a long time since I've looked at this. It's all from memory. But the important part is that the government can own it and be the shareholder, but there's a nominee company where those shares are not disclosed, which could point back to legacy financiers, or it could point back to the crown itself. These aren't disclosed. It's a special type of company. But the most important thing is that the institutions that get to create the fiat currency, where the Bank of England socializes the losses and privatizes the gains, are all located in a special jurisdiction called the City of London. And the City of London is a different country in itself, with its own laws, with its own thing. And even the Crown needs permission to enter the City of London. It's a square mile with 700 banks and financial institutions. And it's actually got its own jurisdiction, not to be confused with London or United Kingdom or England. And so you see these halos like the Vatican, with the Vatican Bank, where much of the drug dealing and laundering happens. Switzerland with the Bank for International Settlements, which was set up in post-World War I to manage reparations, connected to Reichsbank, the German central bank, that also funded the Hitler regime and fascism, as well as many of the wars like the Bolsheviks to overthrow and install the Soviet Union in Russia, as well as create the Federal Reserve with the Warburgs in America. And so these same, legacy institutions were there in order to finance wars, launder money, and obfuscate it, the reality of this happening. And that still is a structure that I believe exists today. But mainly the Bank of England feeds up to they're a shareholder in the Bank for International Settlements, and the largest shareholder for the Bank for International Settlements is the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is owned by the clearing member banks that are all public companies, and their largest shareholder is BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, if you follow the money.
Yeah, that sounds labyrinthine, presumably by design. Have you just described the essence of the financial industrial complex?
What I call the financial industrial complex is a set of institutions that are aligned by incentives, whereby the incentives enforce the power structure. And so rather being like, people think of it as like a committee of 300 in a room that determine whether there's wars or there's not wars, and it's more of like an organized cabal. I follow it from incentives and game theory. And so central banking is absolutely the root of the system, because it socializes the losses and privatizes the gains. It sets the price of money that determines when you can rug pull the government and move to a new order or not. But you can use it to asset strip the economy for everything it's worth. And you can load the government up with debt and privatize all the gains. That process consists of a series of financial institutions. The private commercial banks create the fiat currency. They create money every time they issue a loan. And it's a Ponzi scheme. There's not enough money to pay off all the debt they create. So you have to roll over the debt. In order to roll it over, you need to basically securitize and financialize every business. That's what the investment bank does. It turns them into public companies. Then you can install your own board, and then the executives work for you. You need to control the price, which is the hedge fund industry and the derivatives market. There are many times more derivatives than there are underlying products, whether it be shares, whether it be commodities, whatever it may be. You also have the asset managers. They pull together everybody's money, and then you give them your voting rights and the ability to install a board. And so then through these funds, they get to allocate all the capital. And so right now, they control 50% of all the capital that's allocated through ETFs. And so the financial industrial complex, the institutions change. The power changes based upon, the how many shares you own in the system. But the financial industrial complex remains, and it sits above governments. In fact, it controls governments. So the financial lobbies are some of the most powerful lobbies. And politicians are just paid for rent prostitutes.
A quick word from our sponsor.
Cena Crisps.
I used to eat loads and loads of crisps in my normie days, and then of course I discovered that they're all cooked in toxic seed oils, and so I pretty much gave up. The people behind Cena have come up with a brilliant idea of cooking crisps not in seed oils but in coconut oil, so they're actually not harmful to you. And they also taste good. Was that a good idea to eat my crisps in the middle of the advert? I'm not sure. Anyway, I just want to make something absolutely clear. Just because I'm starting to do crisp adverts doesn't mean I'm about to become the new Gary Lineker. That's a joke that will go completely over the head of non-British viewers, and I envy those who don't know who Gary Lineker is. They're organic, they are not ultra-processed food, no seed oils, and you can find them at www.sinacrisps, that's S for sugar, I-N-A, crisps.com.
Use the code JAMES for 15% off your order.
So again, I'm not Gary Lineker, and I envy those of you who don't know who Gary Lineker is. I'm advertising crisps, but they are good crisps. They taste good, and they're cooked in coconut oil. So check out Sina Crisps.
Use the code JAMES, James, that's me, for 15% off your order.
Now, back to the Delingpole.
The power changes based upon, the how many shares you own in the system. But the financial industrial complex remains, and it sits above governments. In fact, it controls governments. So the financial lobbies are some of the most powerful lobbies, and politicians are just paid for rent prostitutes. And so what you do is you create a network of non-governmental organizations and think tanks. You write the policies, you sponsor the politicians to get your policy through lobby financing. And then you change the laws through whether it be House of Lords in the case of UK or whether it be Senate in the case of US. And through some of the companies under your structure. So think of all the companies are public. Many of them are military companies. Those military companies like Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, General Dynamic, they have access to what we could call the deep state, CIA, Mossad, MI6. And so through these intelligence networks, they're able to launch covert wars and overt wars as well. But you can control these processes through access to capital. And so most of what people focus on is their focus on a power structure that is subordinate to another power structure. We all whinge and moan about the government.
Yeah.
We all whinge and moan about Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, or Boris Johnson, when really they answer to greater powers. And Liz Truss, in the case of the UK, found that out very easily when the Bank of England said, no, that's not the right policy. Even now, we've just had another regime change. We've had 7 regime changes in 10 years in the UK. And Keir Starmer, what was his contribution? He mainly, prior to being the Prime Minister, I get the two a bit mixed up. I become a bit too Americanized here. The Prime Minister, he tried to take down Julian Assange, which was revealing all the crimes against humanity that the military-industrial complex were committing in the Middle East. And he tried to put in a sex offender allegation on top of Julian Assange. Now, what was Keir Starmer's biggest contribution and most impactful policy? Well, of course, it was spreading the lie that Britain is defending democracy in Ukraine, while it laundered significant funds up to military contractors that they're still doing to this day in order to prop up the stock market and value of many of the military companies. While the Bank of England printed the money, and we used the country as a collateralized debt obligation to issue IMF debt, so that BlackRock ends up with all the resources that Russia doesn't have left. And he'll fight that to the last Ukrainian. And then we just get another regime change when people start to figure out the jig. And so now you have a white nationalist uprising with Rupert Lowe or Nigel Farage, and everyone says it's the immigrants why this is happening, and they create a new other and a new story, and nothing changes because you're always looking at the other or you're looking at the politician, when the politician is a prostitute for real power, the financial industrial complex.
Yeah. At what point do you reckon in their careers do the politicians realize what the game is? I mean, Boris Johnson, for example, do you think he always knew what the deal was and was just waiting for his turn at the trough when he became prime minister? Or do you think it came as a shock to him to realize, no, hang on a second, you don't get to make decisions, that you're in hock to this labyrinthine system?
I think both. So they groom politicians. So if you look at, for example, J.D. Vance, he was groomed by Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is part of Palantir, the technical industrial complex, the police and surveillance state. Other nodes that Peter Thiel was connected with is Elon Musk and David Sachs, all people that were involved in the PayPal mafia. So they represent a faction of power, like the technical industrial complex. They're subordinate to FIC as well because they need access to capital. But you groom them. So sometimes you make JD Vance, you give him a new name. That's not his name. You give him a venture capital.
What is his name?
I can't remember off memory. I'm sure AI will tell you what his real name is, or people could put it in the comments. But that was his stage name.
Right.
And then he was given a venture capital fund, and he was made vice president. At what stage in the process? Well, they align your financial incentives. And I think the higher you go, the more compromised you become at a faster rate. This was really one of the many operations. We focus on Jeffrey Epstein, but there are many more. Jeffrey Epstein is just one of many. These are network blackmail operations to compromise people, and it starts small. You finance someone's campaign, then they have to try and get your policy through. If they successfully manufacture a narrative that they pretend they're working for the people while they're working for the lobby, then they become more useful to power. And so then you climb those ranks, or you stay exactly where you are. As you climb the ranks, they introduce you to a handler. And then maybe you need more financing in order to get to the next stage of your political career. Maybe they can make you participate in an activity that compromises you. Maybe you don't participate. There's unwritten rules and incentives until eventually you're very useful to power. At that stage, you can become a prime minister and a president. And if you ever go against it, you can, you either don't get access to the capital, the media machine comes after you and tears you down, or at the extreme, you get JFK'd if you take on the military industrial complex. And so, they've got a number of tools and they don't use the most extreme tools. But I recognize this when I was in investment banking. I could see very early what I needed to do to climb the ladder. And it's just an incentive mechanism that compromises you until eventually you have the share options in the bank and you're an executive on the board. And then you're preserving the power structure that pays you, and you're more and more compromised the further you rise.
So what did you have to do, or what would you have had to do to get on? What kind of things?
Well, they test you. Firstly, they take you to parties, and those parties, many of the higher level performers, your managers, they'll be participating in drugs, narcotics. Maybe there's women that are offered. Maybe it leads to prostitution. If you take the bite, then you're probably indoctrinated. It's like a mafia, right? The first thing you have to do to join the mafia is take someone out, and you have to put the tattoo on that identifies you. These are indications that you're willing to do what you're willing to do in order to climb the ladder. You can see the things. It's either financing, it's either incentives to get higher salaries, it's share options, financial incentives, and then they get more and more seedy the higher you want to go, and the more you want to be initiated into the power structure, where you're someone like Jamie Dimon and you're actually a Jeffrey Epstein's banker at that stage, then you need to be more and more compromised.
Well, how deep does the compromise go? I mean, are we talking sort of satanic ritual stuff at the higher levels?
Well, how is the deep state and the intelligence operations funded? They're funded off balance sheet. It's money that you have money probably about 5% of their money comes from national security, the bit you can put on the balance sheet that's acceptable. The 95% comes from black ops. What are those black ops? Drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, sex trafficking. And those operations are as seedy as you want to get. And we do know, I haven't spent too much time on these types of satanic rituals and things, but to me, I try and think of it in terms of, yes, there could be people that are like that, or there could be a machine that encourages that type of behavior in order to get to the most compromised and the highest levels of power.
What are those industries worth? I mean, are they worth more than the non-black economy, if you add them all up?
Well, I mean, we're talking, you can look at the biggest markets in the world. You've got what we know, the stock market, the bond market, the FX markets. I couldn't put an exact number on the size of the black markets. But we do know that the incentive structure of all these markets is because they're protected by intelligence, and it's actually a vital part of their funding. How anyone could ever put a size on this, I don't know how anyone would come to that number. But you can read, there's many books that have been written in terms of like how these operations work. And
Yeah. I get up to a point that this system has been created, and it doesn't really matter which individuals are in place because they're dispensable and they could easily be replaced by another individual, and that the system attracts aggressively ambitious, morality-free scumbags, basically.
I'd say they manufacture them. So you could start as just ambitious.
Yeah.
And by the time you're at the top, you're engaging in activities you never imagined you would participate in.
Right.
Because it is a process of incentives and manufacturing the type of person that they need in order to preserve the power structure.
And the people who say no just end up being booted out or not made a senior partner or whatever.
Yeah, regime change, stuck at a lower level of the career path, at its extreme, expelled, taken out, depends what you know.
So what was it in you that made you resist this process? I mean, did you watch all your contemporaries going, yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that prostitute. I'll take the line of Charlie. I'll take the whatever.
Yeah. So, I would say that my mission I was driven by was trying to help my father figure out how he'd lost his money. That was like my driving force.
Yeah.
And I think some lucky accidents. So I told you like certain things. Firstly, there were books that I read that helped me understand the system early. So I read like books like Michael Rowbotham's, which is Grip of Death. I read a lot of the books like Confessions of an Economic Hitman and various other things. So I was able to see the system through reading and then kind of have an indication of where this goes.
Yeah.
And I'd say that what I've learned is there's kind of three types of people, and it's very difficult to become one of them. And I was blessed to be able to become one of them. There's one type of person, which is somebody that's broke, in debt, lives in a country with freedom of speech and can say all this stuff, but they just yap on the internet and they have no power. And they're subordinate, they're in debt. The system doesn't mind those people. Sometimes you have, censorship regimes and various other things, but right now they'd rather just have your social credit score and have you talking so that they can build a profile of who you are and what you think. So they can weaponize it through your social credit. But the other type of person they don't mind is somebody that's captured, rich and wealthy. And so if your wealth is attached to preserving the system, they don't mind you. Elon Musk can become a trillionaire, but all of his wealth is based upon borrowing against his stock and then preserving the value of that stock and him getting a continuation of defense contracts for the military, and then providing the data that the intelligence apparatus need to build these social credit scores and control grids. And so as long as you comply, you get to pretend you're the world's first trillionaire. And you know, you get to build things that you can resist against it. But when your wealth is based upon, when your net worth is determined by the preservation of the system, you're kind of just not incentivized. So what they don't want is people that build wealth outside the system, that are not incentivized to preservation of the system, that can actually have enough wealth to influence politics or enough of a voice to influence change. And if you do have some of those, there's just not that many of them, where the sum of the whole system has more capital, more money, and more power than any of these whistleblowers or breakaway people, you know, these wild cards, I call them. And so they don't mind a few wild cards. They don't mind loads of people that have no power, that just talk, and they want to make sure that the majority of the wealth is captured. And so those are the three types of people. Now, the reason they want to capture Bitcoin and gold and various other things is it allows you to build wealth outside the system. And when you build wealth outside the system, you can become that type of person that they don't want you to be. And so they'd rather you have a Bitcoin ETF or a Bitcoin treasury company, or borrow against your Bitcoin through a loan, or invest in some shitcoin scam that they created through Silicon Valley, that we're told is the next Bitcoin killer. They want you gambling, degenerate, short-term thinking, borrowing, leveraged. They want you to have leveraged wealth. And then they don't mind, because then you're captured into their system. So wealth outside the system is the bit they don't want. And they don't want a lot of people. They can handle a few.
Well, literally, they don't want a lot of people. I mean, they want to kill us one way or the other, whether it's war or vaccines or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's different agendas here as well. So when we say there are lots of competing agendas. Their game is ruthless. If you're trying to climb to the top of the MIC, the military industrial complex, the TIC, the technical industrial complex, or the FIC, the financial industrial complex, these guys are ruthless. Like, they're playing a game against each other. They're trying to survive and provide more value and power. But what is really measured by is, I'd say at the very top of the chain, is assets under management. And right now, BlackRock's winning that game. But they're playing a ruthless game as well. They can be taken out. In their place. So they have to, you're not going to be taken out if you're not that important, put it that way, and right now the game has changed, because I think it used to be like, the American empire was built upon military power, like the MIC. But when we left the gold standard, the FIC dominated the MIC, because there was no constraint on government spending. And so FIC financialized everything from that moment. Then it became like the petrodollar, and the backbone was energy. But now we're moving towards algorithm and data being more important, which is the TIC. And so really, the TIC just wants data. And so we used to be under an agenda of censorship and control of media. And you still have those the traditional media is still controlled by its sponsors and the capital markets that it serves. The alternative media is really more, it's more powerful, because you can incentivize the speech that you want through algorithm. And so rather than giving people, you can give people freedom of speech, say whatever you want, but we won't give you freedom of reach. To get reach, you need to say what we need you to say. And we can also radicalize you through what content we give you into the most radical version of yourself. And then we can compartmentalize you into a box. You're far right, you're radical left, you're anti-Muslim, you're anti-Zionist, And they compartmentalize you into the most radical version of yourself by continually feeding you content that reinforces the most radical version of you. And then you just point at the other. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy. Then you can manufacture civil unrest when you need to. And when you manufacture civil unrest, you've already got the legal documents. Just like before 9/11, they already had the Patriot Act written, which is why they needed 9/11. And just like COVID, they already had, the Fauci operations in order to fund these biolabs in Wuhan that are now releasing the documents with Tulsi Gabbard right now. And they already had the vaccine. And who did we have in our leadership? We had Boris Johnson that administered the shutdown. You had Rishi Sunak, who was the largest shareholder via his Indian investments in the ones that were profiting from the vaccines. And so you can see how the politicians match the policy. But there are certain policies which are written by think tanks and non-government organizations. One of those in 1968 was the Club of Rome. It was a particular think tank. And one of their agendas was a belief that you need depopulation. There's also a coincidence of wants. Right now, today, we have demographic issues. There's not a large enough taxpayer base to pay the boomers that are now retiring, and we have a pension crisis. And so there's only a couple of ways of solving that. You either make a way of increasing birth rates, which we're going in the opposite direction. We're going extinct, with the exception of Africans, Middle Easterns, and Southeast Asians. Everyone else, their birth rates are decreasing to the point of extinction, no replacement rate. So they're supplementing it through the manufacturing of wars, rebuild contracts, and immigration crisis. So you can increase the tax base through immigrants. You can then use that to build a police and surveillance state by creating radical versions, racial tensions, religious tensions, all the things where you're saying, why is my life so much worse? It must be because they took my job. So you can point to the other. But what you really want is what we're getting here, what Trump gave us, the Genius Act, the Big Beautiful Bill, the Clarity Act, the programmable police and surveillance state, which was already beta tested through the Palestinian laboratory, the integration of drones into Ukraine with artificial intelligence and Palantir, the pre-crime arrest technology that was implemented throughout UK, the open border, closed border that ran across Palantir with the Biden administration and Trump administration, the crowd control that was used in Hajj in Saudi Arabia, and all these different things that you can see. So the Club of Rome was a particular think tank. It doesn't mean that they ultimately rule. It means there is policy that is written that involves believing a belief, an economic theory, that you depopulate. And so I would argue that COVID, whether coordinated, manufactured, or real and weaponized, whatever you want to believe, fulfilled a depopulation agenda, as well as profiting from the solution, as well as manufacturing the problem, which we know was a bioweapon via Ukraine into the Wuhan lab, funded by Fauci and the intelligence apparatus.
Yeah, but the whole Fauci biolabs thing and the biolabs that are all in Ukraine, etc., this is just another. It's designed to kind of fool a certain section of the populace into thinking there really was a virus and that there wasn't a lab leak, was there? That's just another bollocks theory they put out to try and sell the narrative.
Well, I mean, I don't like to get too deep into subjects I'm not an expertise in. What I do is I follow incentives and leave the experts to determine, was it a thing, was it not a thing? Because there's different beliefs. You could manufacture the thing, or you could make up a BS narrative that the thing was, and put a death counter on the media and scare the hell out of people into thinking, if you leave your house, you're going to kill your grandma. And then you radicalize people into, staring at the TV every day, watching the death counter. And think back to your time, right? There was a day when you were told you must social distance, you must get a jab, you must not leave your house. and you were watching the number of deaths go up every day. That was a very traumatizing experience for many, particularly people that believe that the media is the truth, not just an agenda that's funded by policy. And so but remember, I remember that day. Do you remember that day when one day we were told that if we don't get the 5th booster, like, we're going to kill our grandma? And then one day, Putin invaded Ukraine, and suddenly we were able to go out and protest and do whatever we want to defend democracy, and COVID was no longer an issue, and there was no death counter, and all we were fed is Putin is Hitler,
Yes.
and that we're defending democracy. So the media in one day went from, if you don't get this jab, you're going to kill your grandma, to go out and protest and defend democracy because Putin is Ukraine. And guess what? You need to print billions of dollars while there's homeless, drug addiction, wealth inequality, problems at home. But you need to give it to Ukraine, and you need to put a flag in your bio, and if you're not, then you're an evil killer that supports communism, and you're a radical lefty that believes, and you can see that throughout our life. 9/11, the manufacturing of terrorism. So you can see these false flags throughout your whole life. And now, what I don't try and do is say this is definitely how it was, because these are pretty complicated things. And if you go deep into any of them, you can either weaponize something that happens because you radicalize people so much, or you can do a covert or overt operation, or you can just manufacture a media narrative that makes people believe it. And all of those have been used. And you won't know this. Like right now, we get all the declassified CIA documents from Operation Ajax, Operation Gladio, where they manufactured terrorists, Operation Ajax, where they do regime change in Iran. You get all these when it's too late, when it doesn't really matter. And so we'll get these declassified documents, and then they'll also be declassified where you black out the bits that hide the power structure, just like we had with the Epstein files. You don't get the actual people, the JP Morgans that settled with the victims. You get the version of the assets that are being taken out. Rather than, and the power structure still prevails. And then everyone just focuses on that when it's too late to matter. And then you build your social credit score by talking about it. And then they weaponize that against you in order to usher in this police and surveillance state and put you in the blocks and make you more radical.
You gave a good example there of this, a thing that makes absolutely no sense. Where, as you say, one day it was wear a mask, take the vaccine to save Granny. The next it was we must join plucky Ukraine's fight against evil Putla. And I remember, I don't read the newspapers anymore because I too had an epiphany, and I realized that the whole system was corrupt. And I was looking at the front page of my wife's newspaper, and it was boasting about the fact that British-made Storm Shadow missiles had been used to attack some Russian targets. And the thrust of this piece was, it was clear that it was expecting of the reader that the reader should be excited by this blow that Britain was striking. And I was thinking, hang on a second, when did we declare war on Russia? Where is this money coming from? I never recall being asked whether I wanted my money spunked on a Storm Shadow missile. Now, that's my reaction, and presumably that's your reaction as well. How is it, given that it is so obvious when you look at it, why do people not see it?
Well, there was another operation called Operation Mockingbird. And Operation Mockingbird is when the CIA took over the media, in the case of the US, and they created these different media outlets that would cater for your your people. And so whether it be CNN on the left or Fox News on the right, they would distract you with believing that your side is right and everyone else is crazy. And they would distract you with politics, so you look left and right at all times: Labour, Conservative, Democrat, Republican, Communist, Capitalist. Racial tensions, religious tensions, and it was to distract you with everything but what was real, what would actually matter. And the other thing it did is it created deliberate operations to mock people that would ever expose this. This is where the term conspiracy theory came from. The term conspiracy theory came from the CIA in Operation Mockingbird to call anyone that exposed the system a conspiracy theorist. So then it would make you into a category that was very unsociable and undesirable for you to be ostracized and compartmentalized. And then they did other things. They would take the reveal of the conspiracy theory and make it deliberately crazy and kooky, so that you sounded like, a 9/11 truther, where there would be there would be theories out there where there's a fake plane and someone was drying it on a remote control, or they would make the conspiracy theories more and more radicalized, and they'd use people like, whether it be Tucker Carlson or something, whether people know who they're working for, or Alex Jones. Half the time people don't know who they're working for, because it's an incentive mechanism with sponsorships and various other operations. We saw Alex Jones, $47 billion settlement case. Then he comes back as a new person.
The truth.
You know what I mean?
That was the moment I knew.
This is psychological operations at the highest level. And so it is all based upon your desire to fit in, to not be ridiculed, to not be cancelled. And you are, as soon as you're born, right, it happens at the education system.
Yeah.
You are downloaded a set of history that was written from the winners of the history. You then go through a university system that downloads into you a set of beliefs that you start to think are your own. And then it happens with politics. The media downloads into you a set of beliefs and you start to find your side. Maybe it was allegiance with your father. Maybe it was allegiance with someone influential. And so you think that you came up with your beliefs, but they were downloaded like an operating system into you. And you can tell, because I could take someone, when you understand these different compartments, that, for example, hates Islam, and I could tell you who he supports, what party he's on, all the other beliefs, whether he supports Israel, whether he believes resist. You can have a menu of what they believe in based upon them telling me one thing, because I knew that belief system was manufactured and operated, and that person will defend it till the end. They believes it's their belief. But no, you predictably believe a set of things that, when you understand these patterns, I can tell you all the other things you believe in, because it was an operating system that was installed into you through psychological operations. And you never decided, am I that religion? Do I believe that? How did I become that? Where did I learn that stuff? And so the process of becoming your own person is actually a multi-decade unwinding process of relearning all history, and touching upon the hardest of questions. So it's very difficult. Like, the vast majority of people, they're too broke figuring out how to pay their credit card debt and why their family now needs 3 people to work, and why they're feeling like a demasculated man that can't look after their family, that's deep in debt, feeling, just feeling a bad version of themselves that distracts them. And that's what I'm saying. They want these people. They want people captured, people that have no power, that can say what they want. But there's very few people outside the system and have the time and financial capacity to recognize why are we where we are? Why is this happening? And then you get ridiculed as a conspiracy theorist and compartmentalized. So it's a very sophisticated system. It's quite remarkable when you think about it.
It is very sophisticated. I was going to ask you something, because something you mentioned earlier, sort of a light bulb went off in my head. You probably don't know much about my history, but I used to be quite a successful mainstream media journalist. I mean, people knew who I was. I used to write sort of comment pieces in the Mail, and the Mail on Sunday, Telegraph. I had a column in the Spectator, and when I met people at parties, they'd kind of be impressed because they'd met somebody who was whatever. And then I had my epiphany, and I became a podcaster, and I started talking about crazy subjects like 9/11, moon landings, all the things I was discovering on the way. And I built up a reasonable following, based partly on the people who'd followed me who liked my journalism, because I was very good. I mean, I was a very good writer, very compelling, entertaining. So people sort of followed me and often came with me down the rabbit hole. So my journey was their journey. And it was great in the early days, during COVID, where we all felt like we were resisting this tyranny that many of us had been unaware of before. We trusted the system, and now suddenly we realized that we were being sold a lie about COVID, and maybe about everything else too. So I built up this audience, and I thought, well, this is great. I'm part of this resistance movement, and I'm able to just about make a living monetizing my content. Not quite as much as I made as journalism, but it's all going fine. And this happened for 2 or 3 years, and it was great, and I felt loved and wanted. And then in the last year or so, I suddenly started discovering that we weren't all on the same page. We weren't all one sort of coherent resistance movement. Where okay, we accepted that we weren't in agreement on everything, but we were all heading in the same direction. I found myself being sniped at by fellow podcasters whom hitherto I'd thought about very little. I certainly didn't think of them as a threat or as rivals. I just thought like they were nothing, just they didn't mean it, because we were all doing our own thing. I was doing my shtick, they were doing their shtick. And I was wondering whether this process is a function of what you described, whereby they, whoever they are so good at manipulating algorithms and access to data and reach and so on, that they are able to engineer these. I mean, it saves them the trouble of. I thought at the beginning I was going to get taken out. I thought I was going to get, well, I mean, it may still happen. It may still happen to you, I suppose. I thought I was going to get bumped off because I was an ex-establishment journalist who had suddenly discovered too much and was saying it to everyone who'd listen. And now I think, no, that's not how they do it. They just kind of marginalize you. They get random people to kind of have a go at you, try and reduce your. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make sense, and I think it's a very interesting conversation. And I really appreciate you sharing like how it was in your area, because once you see these things, right, you look back at your life and you think, yeah, I like where do these things come in? Like, it's very subtle. And it is like a social proofing concept, a desire to fit in. And then you realize that there are these, if you look back at like the whole root of the war economy, it was based upon marginalization, divide and conquer, and making everyone so divided that they're easy to conquer. And I think that's never stopped, but the technology has changed. And so there was one time when nobody knew the game. Like, imagine if we were alive during, my dad was alive for World War II. And, in order to get the news, you went to the cinema once a week. and whatever they told you in that 20 minutes was the truth. That's all you knew, right? Then there was newspapers or whatever it may be, but many people couldn't afford it or whatever. So we were in a world where the defense of the never letting the truth come out was the most important thing for preservation. Then we kind of like transitioned into the internet, the resistance against the internet, all the different mediums. And if you think of each one, we had more and more and more and more information until we're at the point today where it's like unbelievable amount of information that we're able to access. And so we went through a phase where I think it was cancellation. I'll take you off Facebook. I'll take you off Twitter. There's gatekeepers in the traditional media. You try and write an article and there's a higher infrastructure that says we can't publish that, and whatever the mechanism may be. So there was a cancellation phase. But I do believe now we've entered into a phase where say whatever you want and we know how to weaponize it. And that's the divide and conquer phase. And so maybe ignorantly, I don't fear too much being taken out. There was a time when I think I would have. Famous last words. But now I don't think they care, because we built the technology with AI where we've hit this extreme level of there are people that are going to own the infrastructure and there's everyone else. And now we've built a business plan that needs civil unrest, that needs a lack of faith in the system. Because the technocratic and the private corporate interests and the thick Mick and Dick, the Mick is now cybersecurity and artificial intelligence and robotic-based military weapons that don't require humans. We're entering into that phase where warfare is different. And the more speech, the more they know about you, the more you can be weaponized when they're ready to release that weapon. And they need civil unrest in order to get there. So that's why everything's about the police and surveillance state right now, rather than censorship. And I've definitely noticed that. But yeah, divide and conquer has always been the way. Every movement I've ever joined starts with a group of people that unify. They drop their differences and they unify around a common cause.
Yeah.
And then slowly there's a psychological thing that kicks in, where the more time you spend with each other, you find your differences. And then those differences suddenly become drama. And then that drama becomes the source of the media, where everyone talks about, oh, did you know that these two people fell out over this? And then suddenly that becomes the media. And so the media always knew that negativity and degeneracy and drama and gossip was the way of distracting, right? It's the old Colosseum. Get them fighting each other and killing each other, and then they can release their testosterone over there, while slowly we're building this empire, and that's always been the game. I think what I've noticed is that the more I look at it, the game and the psychological triggers have never changed. Weaponized religion, weaponized tensions, divide and conquer, point manufacture and other, get people to believe in nationalism, a political system, change the leader, and everything will change. You have to just keep people distracted with believing that the things they're focusing on are ultimately the things that matter. The war strategy of balkanize and just make people believe that okay, if we just turn Somaliland rather than Somalia, then we can have our own very unpowerful, balkanized, controlled little jurisdiction that's ours. And then we're working for the power structure that's way more powerful than us anyway. So just break it up. I mean, and that's the history of the Middle East, right? Sykes-Picot was to draw a bunch of lines with a bunch of racial tensions and religious tensions that guarantee that the region will be in war forever for as long as we can monetize it. And the moment any one of these Arab leagues or a nationalist movement would unify around their energy, you eliminate it at all costs and you create strategic tension. The best book on this was a book called Operation Gladio that I read by Paul Williams. And it describes the manufacturing of strategic tension. And it's strategically manufacturing tension so that you can fund both sides of any type of war. And you manufacture terrorists, communists, radical lefts, far rights. And you pay people like Tommy Robinson in order to make those happen, sponsored by Elon Musk, who's got the technical solution for what comes for the pre-crime police agenda. And so, you know, you can just look at the incentives and the model and bet that there is a part of the power structure that's trying to make that happen. And there's another part of the power structure that's trying to go on another path. And that's the friction, the strategic tension.
So war is it their primary business model?
Well, war is integrated into it's not primary. It's a mechanism for getting the resources that you need, making the profits from the war. The forever war is very profitable. For anyone that thinks that Afghanistan was about winning, they don't understand the business model. A 20-year war that justifies $2 trillion of debt issuance that was then spent back into the stock market and the defense contractors is incredibly successful. And then to take a version of the Taliban that was resisting against the drug opium trade and replace it with a version of the Taliban that is allowing the drug opium trade to flow is an incredibly successful operation. That's $2 trillion of profits, a regime change that allows the CIA, MI6 and Mossad to continue their drug trafficking cartels. An obfuscation that it looks like when you need to dump the US empire, you've got a series of forever wars. And then eventually you can create something like the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, where America couldn't exert its force, just like the Suez Canal with the British Empire in Egypt. And then you can change the empire. And so what's the profit? The profit is the destruction, the continuation of the forever war, and then you profit from the rebuild when it's 10 times more profitable than continuing the forever war. So when I was an investment banker, we used to work with the big consulting firms. And I remember like seeing things like even John Perkins in Confessions of an Economic Hitman. The consulting firms would put together a model of when peace was 10 times more profitable than the forever war versus the starting of the war. And so if you want peace, you have to come up with a business model where there's 10 times more profit than continuing the forever war. And so war is a racket, as John Smedley, I think, what was it? Sorry, I'm butchering the name.
Was it Smedley Butler?
Smedley Butler, thank you very much. John Smedley was a clothes brand. Smedley Butler.
Sea Island cotton, very nice.
Absolutely. See, the things that are in our mind, these advertising, like where you pull into this. I was like, John Smedley, where have I
Your
heard
top
that?
could actually be John Smedley.
It looks like one, isn't it? It's one of those cotton ones, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, we are manufacturers, the clothes we wear, the brands, Beans means Heinz, like all these things. You see these psychological operations and you have to continually catch yourself. Is this my thought or was it downloaded into me? Where did I go? Yes, it is a racket. It's a well-defined business model. And it feeds into the technical police and surveillance grids as well that are being built right now. Beta test it in Gaza. And what they want to build in Gaza is what they want to build in Britain and across the world in America, they call them freedom cities. In Europe, we call them smart cities. In Gaza, we call it a concentration camp. And it's the same people involved. You use Israel to test the technology. You test it in Gaza with an open air prison. And then Palantir, the same one that did genocide as a service and occupation as a service, is the same technology that the NHS, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the Trump border control. Even in America, you have the privatized prison sector. Like, that's one massive racket. The more I knew somebody that got arrested by ICE, a British person, that was arrested by ICE on the border. And he was just literally driven from prison to prison every time he was about to see a judge, because he knew there was no case. But every time you get driven into a new prison, there's a new check that's written. And even the privatization of the deportation industry, you get paid a dividend per deportation, as well as a dividend per arrest. And you just create privatized incentive structures. ICE is owned by Geo Group and funded by Core Civic, which are the two companies that profit from the privatized prison sector. And you have 2 million Americans that are deported in America, the highest population to incarceration rate in the world. And you can see the stock price of the companies that benefit from it. And so war is a racket. And this is the next, if you eventually can't exert influence in a US dominated world, then what do? You bring it home. And so they're creating the domestic terrorist. You create protests, and those protests are infiltrated by intelligence. Yeah. And then you say, hey, if you support Palestine, you're now a domestic terrorist. And you create the environment that justifies the technology that builds what the legislation needed to change. You see it across the UK everywhere right now.
It's why they invented gangster rap as well, to put more black people in prison. That was the purpose.
I completely agree. And so if you look at the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the compartmentalization of the ghettos, the drug trades that the CIA deliberately injected, you had the wars where you eliminated any uprising, and you had, MOVE, for example, where literally they bombed like the ghettos because they were organizing and doing well and building their own universities.
Where was this? Sorry,
the MOVE, MOVE. It was like where like the military was put on top of like some of the ghettos that were building their own parallel systems within the black communities. And they literally just bombed them and killed them because just like they did in Gaza. And if you share any of these things, what happens immediately? Everyone watching this will say, hey, is Simon a far right, radical left socialist that believes, and like someone else will listen to say, hey, I'm a white nationalist. And everyone has their own installed view that tries to put me in a box based upon me just sharing objective, documented history and incentives that lead to it. So the very difficult part of this is that I could describe that and you've already made assumptions around who I am based upon sharing that story. And so there's no doubt that hip hop music and the music industry and the result that, this whole how to weaponize racial tensions and manufacture the result that you want. And then they pull out all the data and you'll just say, well, white people do less crime than black people. And then if you have an opinion on that, they compartmentalize you into a box that leads you to wanting to be defensive against that because you've subscribed to some ideology that you probably never consciously decided.
Yeah. Absolutely. I got distracted with something. I was going to ask you about what were we talking about before we got onto the gangster rap?
I think we were talking about like Operation Gladio and stay-at-home armies and manufacturing terrorism and domestic terrorism, and in order to get civil unrest and infiltration.
Yeah, I'm curious as to. So you've got these sort of competing mafia families, if you like. So you've got the Fick and the Mick and the Tick. You mentioned earlier that the Fick wins because ultimately that's got access to the money. But you're suggesting that the tick could be overtaking it.
Yeah, so at the moment, all of these technology companies, we just had the SpaceX IPO. The SpaceX IPO happened at a 1.75 trillion valuation. Now, what is it doing? Essentially, when you go public at that valuation, you create what's called an ATM. And an ATM is where you use your own stock as your currency. And so immediately they acquired Cursor, which is an AI company that helps you code and instead of having developers. And so by having this valuation, you're able to concentrate more and more of the smaller companies into an ever larger and growing monopoly. And so if you look at the S&P 500 today, 40 to 50% of it is the Magnificent Seven that's now becoming the Magnificent 10 when you IPO Anthropic and OpenAI and these other things.
Yeah.
And so the technical industrial complex is now 50% of the S&P. But what's really interesting is we've got this strategic tension with China, where China genuinely is using AI in order to improve their manufacturing processes. Whereas America is trying to monetize it and put everyone into a subscription model where you can't function without buying the tokens. China can now do it 10 times cheaper than the American models at 90% the efficiency. And and also they've got, the access to the alternative energy sources. And we've got, these different things. Where was I going? Okay, yes. So the valuation of these companies can be rug pulled at a second if China reveals what it's built. And so you use these stock valuation models in order to concentrate wealth, and then you use the crisis to concentrate wealth. So the global financial crisis benefited the FIC more than anyone else because you can socialize the losses and privatize the gains. You can take out all of the smaller institutions and bail them out with the larger institutions. So each crisis concentrates more power into a fewer and fewer hands. Now, at the moment, the FIC is able to play the game because they can launch currency wars. They can use the derivatives markets in order to destroy share prices. They can portfolio manage through the control of capital. And so they can make everyone subordinate to capital. But there is an interesting dynamic that's coming right now, which is what if the blackmail operation became everyone talking to their therapist in ChatGPT? What if the data actually became the currency, which I think it is moving more and more towards? So what if you could rug pull all of the markets simultaneously? You could rug pull the stock market by revealing the overvaluation as a result of China's AI. You could rug pull the commodity market by revealing that the West has many times more derivative contracts and Shanghai has all backed gold in China. You could rug pull the bond market by China and Japan selling all of their treasuries and manufacturing a bailout where the Fed is the one that can purchase all those bonds. So China could rug pull the whole market if they wanted. But what are they doing instead? Well, the Beijing meeting with Trump had all the executives of the MIC, FIC, and TIC in one place meeting with Xi Jinping. And they were all saying, take this as my interpretive. I couldn't prove any of this.
Yeah.
But I imagine that Elon Musk was sat down with Xi Jinping saying, please, 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 I need these rare earth minerals for my EV batteries. And I still need, and Tim Cook from Apple was saying, please, 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 while we're pretending we're rebuilding our manufacturing base in America, there's no way I can sell an iPhone for $10,000. Please make sure our warehouses and our manufacturing factories in Apple are still allowed to function in China under cheap labor. And don't worry, Huawei can go and do and copy it, and you can create your phones. And the same people that work for Apple can go and then work for Huawei. But just don't make me build my manufacturing base in America, because then that breaks my whole business model. I imagine that Visa and MasterCard were saying, I know you've built guardrails around your SIP system. And I know that we cannot, you've built a network of central bank digital currencies through Mbridge that circumvents SWIFT. But how can we integrate into your system so at least when we can charge fees going into the SIPS network? And I know you understand the game. You built guards around your financial system. We can't penetrate it. But how can we do that? And also, how can we win the AI game together? We know that we can pretend we're going to go to World War III. And we all know that we can't manufacture a weapon in America without China's commodities, rare earth minerals, refinements, and everything that our military companies need in order to be able to exert military force. We need you for that. But don't worry, we won't touch Taiwan. But maybe we can figure out what we're going to do with our chips. You become chip independent, we become chip independent, and we carry on the narrative of that we're actually in an AI arms race. Because that allows you to manufacture more while we make more profit in the stock market. And the more that you can sell to us, the more we can keep the jig up of pretending we're going to go to World War III and that that's actually possible. Because that props up our stock market, which then means that we buy more goods from you. And so there's a codependency between China and the FIC and the MIC and the TIC. But China could take this whole thing open source, and that could break everything. And the FIC can't penetrate PBOC because that's a genuinely nationalized central bank with a network of nationalized banks. And they nationalized those when they tried to penetrate the Chinese banking system, through Hong Kong in Shanghai. They did what Putin did. They expelled the banksters. Putin expelled the oligarchs and nationalized the oil. So they got a genuine guard there. But could we just work together to build a global AI technocratic grid? And maybe it doesn't need to be a conspiracy. Maybe it's just the obvious way this goes. Maybe money becomes less important in the future. Maybe we enter into a moneyless world under this grid that we're moving to at a point of singularity. I don't know, but let's hedge it. Let's move to multipolarity. Let's asset strip the West as the financial fix system. And then let's see if we build this global technocratic TIC grid. Maybe we displace the FIC. Maybe the TIC becomes the ruler. And maybe data becomes the resource. And maybe we put the whole world onto a universal basic income, and the ones that control the data and the data centers, which we're concentrating into fewer and fewer hands, maybe they become the FIC of the future. Who knows? Let's play both games and hedge.
Well, you said there were some FIC representatives and some MIC representatives at this same conference. Wouldn't they have resisted, or wouldn't they have seen this particular thing going on?
Yeah, but who owns America? America is a privatized corporation owned by transnational capital, governed by the FIC. America's not a nationalistic. If you think UK, Australia, Canada, Europe, and America are countries, then you've bought into the governments are in charge and politicians run the game. No, they work for FIC. And they are just asset stripping the West and managing a portfolio so that they end up with as much assets under management as possible and politicians that are subordinate to their lobby financing. There is no sovereign countries left other than China. And we don't want to be China because we call that communism and an authoritarian, which it is. It's not communist. It's got capitalism under state authoritarianism. And that means that no company can be bigger than the Chinese Communist Party and the government, which means that authoritarianism reigns. But we've got the opposite. We're run by the Bank for International Settlements, the Federal Reserve, and the financial industrial complex. We just don't know it. We think we got democracies. As long as we buy into that belief that changing the voter and changing the party is what will change the system, then we will never know who we're governed by because we vote with our money. It's our money that actually makes the difference. And FIC knows that, and they got the most money. And so if we've actually all started voting with our money then we could break the FIC if we wanted. All we need to do to break the FIC is stop paying our mortgages and stop paying our rent, and the whole system crumbles. But they want you to believe that it's actually some kind of uprising. And so what are they doing? They're basically making, the next movements are going more left, more social, more, but it's not communism. It's fake. The whole thing is a monetary system that funds both sides. And you're just a useful idiot for power by believing that what you're doing is going to change the system. And once you get that, you realize that it's money that rules the game.
But wouldn't it be rather difficult for us all to stop paying our mortgages? And wouldn't our assets be seized, and wouldn't we be ending up in prison or having our houses taken off us or whatever?
Hence the strategic tension. So the people that would hate that are who? The boomers, where their retirement is based upon their stock value that they built over their whole life, and the ones that have built significant wealth in the property that they own because they were on the right side of the K-shaped economy when they came out of World War II and beyond. You speak to the youth today, they're like, hell yeah! Look at China. They just crashed their property market. That makes it more affordable.
Yeah.
They're like, crash this shit. I don't own any of the assets. I don't own any of the real estate. And so you create the strategic tension, and the strategic tension right now is between men and women that hate each other and are not having families, the wealthy and the people that have the assets and the people that don't. They're on the extreme other sides. A generational gap, a wealth gap, a race, all of these different things. And they've built your algorithm to put you in the box that you need to be in, that feeds you all the data that makes you believe it's them, it's the boomers. They got all the wealth. They've got all the assets. So what do we need to do? Let's go burn down a data center. Maybe that will make a difference. And then what happens? That data center is insured, and the insurance company makes a shit ton of money out of it. And the national debt increases because you end up bailing out the AI companies because the whole stock market is dependent upon it. So you pay the bill and you pay the inflation. So, you think you're rising up to power, but to answer your question, it would require coordination. And it looks like no one's capable of coordinating something like that. And so we continue to comply, which is why I believe that the actual solution is in the exit. It's in the boycott and the exit. I don't think I can change the system, but I think I can take my energy out of the system, and my money can contribute to things that aren't in that system to the extent that I can. You can't get it fully. And maybe if enough people do that, then we could have enough leverage and negotiation power the same way that the FIC has. The FIC had to negotiate with China because they couldn't penetrate China. If they can't penetrate you, you get leverage. You can say you vote with your money. You want your share price to perform? We'll end the boycott. But then you'll be called a radical left, communist, pink hair, LGBTQ, rainbow fairy if you talk like that. And that's how they get you.
I don't think the audience of this particular podcast will be thinking that. They'll be saying, yeah, go Simon, tell us what we need to do. I mean, how do you give yourself this sort of financial China proofing, as it were?
Well, it's FIC and China. They rule the game. So where do we have influence? We have no influence over China, but we do have influence over FIC. That's manifested in their share price, so don't buy their shares. That's manifested in the bond market, so don't buy their bonds. That's manifested in ETFs, so manage your own money rather than have them manage it for you. That's how they control the capital. Choose your currency. Don't use their currency so that they have power for their currency wars. Now, most people, this is a journey that people have to go through. And most people realize that they are fully subordinate to the FIC. Their mortgage, their credit cards, their everything. And so what do? You slowly, each and every month, do the opposite of what they want you to do. They want you deeper in debt. They want you managing any wealth with them. They want you giving your voting rights to them so that they can vote it for you through ETFs and index funds. And you do the opposite. So I work through, well, what do you have to do to boycott the Fed? Well, there's the Fed, there's gold, and there's Bitcoin. Pick your poison. Manage it as a portfolio, whatever you want to do. What do you do to have to boycott BlackRock, who's managing all the fund? Well, you either buy an ETF or you buy your own shares, or you don't invest in the system. You invest in private equity in your local community businesses that actually will make your life better. Because when they want to sell you poison food, you probably want to have investments in your local farmer that can help you at the community level. What if you want to boycott the bank? Well, maybe you can get in a position where you don't need a mortgage. I know that that's very difficult for many people, but maybe you build assets before you build a mortgage, because the mortgage is a backbone of the banking system. Maybe you don't borrow against your assets, where you mine some, which is what they want, where you give them your asset as collateral and they give you a loan. Maybe you take that energy out of the system to the extent you can. So don't leverage your assets. Maybe you make investments that are more conscious. Am I purchasing through Amazon, or am I going to my local farmer to the degree that I can and supporting supply chains of local community networks, that rather than me just taking the easy option all the time? It's a spectrum of subordination to sovereign. And your job is to slowly each month say, I got paid this month. What am I doing with that money? Am I spending less than I own and investing the difference? Where am I investing it and how am I spending it? And each month, does it make me more subordinate or more sovereign? And you do that each month, and you do that for 10 years. They won't tell you that. They won't tell you that because they want you gambling. They want you focusing on how to get rich quick. They want you unhealthy. They want you using their system. They want you doing everything the opposite. They want you eating their food that makes you less healthy. They want you just do the opposite of everything that the media machine is trying to get you to do. And you're probably closer to being on the right track. And be conscious of your algorithms. Understand that they are trying to feed you the information that reinforces your beliefs that you probably never installed and were installed into you, and build your own operating system. And so we need decentralized AI. We need self-custody money, Bitcoin. These are all tools for sovereignty, where you own the terms and you own the environment. Lots you can do. It's overwhelming. It's completely overwhelming. But what you can do each and every month is change your habits, and have a long-term plan and change your time preference.
Can you just briefly, you mentioned earlier the Straits of Hormuz. Is it your theory that this is all part of a planned handover, the sort of the end of the American empire? It's all because I'm looking at this war, alleged war in Iran. It doesn't feel real at all. It just feels like we don't know what's going on. It just feels completely made up.
It's real. It's real. People are dying. But the MIC doesn't care. They monetize death. The FIC monetizes destruction. So if you can have different factors of incentives within Iran, Israel, and America that represent the military industrial complex. So think about Operation Gladio, strategic tension. For 40 years, since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, we were told that there is a group that says death to America, death to Israel. And there was another group that believed that they were protecting the Jewish people, and it's anti-Semitic if you talk against any of the things that they do. Strategic tension. Israel is meant to be in a defense, weaponizing what happened in World War II. And Iran is meant to represent the group that we're told represents the people that did 9/11.
Yeah.
Even though Iran was the biggest enemy of ISIS and Al Qaeda, which are Western funded groups and militias. Okay, but you confuse people into that. Now, what have you done? You created strategic tension between Iran and Israel, two narratives. You use the media to perpetuate that, and you radicalize people into those ideologies. The more radical the militia groups become through war by killing their children and killing their grandmas, the more you have an army that doesn't know who they work for that serve a different agenda. The more you radicalize the Jews, then they go over to Israel, they join the IDF, and they engage in the ethnic cleansing and the Palestinian laboratory. Who profits? Well, American debt markets pay the bill, and the contractors are going to rebuild and pay all the weapons, funnel in money through Israel, and then it's spent back into the American stock market. And you created, through this strategic tension, $10 trillion of profits that went directly into thick bottom line. And the longer you can keep the strategic tension going for, the more you can profit. And so we end up in a scenario where, suspiciously, Iran and Israel are meant to be enemies that are meant to be the most radicalized versions, and yet they never bomb each other until 2024. And we're told that Iran is 2 weeks away from a nuke for 20 to 30 years. And yet that strategic tension is never fully resolved because it made a lot of money for Mick. And then you have different incentives. The Israeli stock market is 40% Mick. Iran has a faction of power within the IRGC that also has their own businesses and their own military industrial complex that also, if you are a sanctioned country, the more you fund resistance, the more leverage you have in order to try and get those sanctions removed. So no conspiracy needs to be built, just a set of incentives that drives the behavior, that creates the strategic tension, that also means, and so that was one faction. What happened with another faction? You had think about it, 1971, America goes off the gold standard. 1973, you have Israel created the Yom Kippur War, that then creates the energy crisis and the embargo that drove the price of oil up like crazy. 1974, you get the creation of the petrodollar, and then you get OPEC as a resistance against the Western oil companies. Safari Club is created as an intelligence covert network funded by George Bush to protect his oil interests. And suddenly, what does Safari Club do? Grooms Osama bin Laden, that leads to the creation of Al Qaeda that later creates ISIS, that were then connected to 9/11. In 1975, the one that did the oil embargo, King Faisal, was assassinated. Then you get the petrodollar. The petrodollar was an agreement between Saudi Arabia that said, price your oil in dollars and then reinvest it into US debt, US treasuries. And when the money is in the Federal Reserve System, the yield on the debt purchases equipment from the MIC and rebuild contracts into Saudi Arabia that allows for a military base to be installed in Saudi that we say is protecting the petrodollar, but in fact is used to create strategic tension between Israel, Saudi, and Iran. And we do the same in Turkey. I could tell you a similar story. We do the same in Egypt. I could tell you a similar story. But for the purpose of time, you've manufactured strategic tension. Now, what changed? What changed is the financial industrial complex created a global structure that ended up in globalization, that ended up with the entire manufacturing base in China. America became energy independent, started fracking under Trump, didn't need to import energy. We moved to an AI world. We need more LNG. This is a new commodity, semiconductor chips for the robotics and all of the computer chips. We need to reset the world order. Right, now on whose terms? So what did Fick do? Fick went and said, I tell you what, Saudi, stop investing in US treasuries and invest in US equities. We'll give you access to every deal. And the Gulf built sovereign wealth funds, trillions of dollars of sovereign wealth funds. And with that money, they stopped buying treasuries and they started buying equities. Now $70 trillion of US assets is foreign owned. By Fick, all the domestic is owned by Fick. Fick worked with the sovereign wealth funds, Norway, Singapore, the Gulf funds. Where did Saudi get all of its money? Where did Qatar get all of its money? It used to be US, but now it's China. China needed all the energy. And so China, the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, fueled all the other sovereign wealth funds across the Gulf. And the Gulf partnered with the Fick and stopped buying treasuries, which fueled the US debt, which fueled Pentagon, which fueled the MIC, and instead partnered with the Fick. And transnational capital now was influenced by Saudi. Saudi went to the Fick and said, why don't we put Saudi Aramco on the stock market? I'll give you 1% of our energy. And the board member, then the CEO of Saudi Aramco became a board member in BlackRock. BlackRock, the Fick that manages, now has to cooperate. And who owns all the AI? Who was in every seed round of XAI, of SpaceX, of NVIDIA? It was the Gulf funds. So the Gulf money became more important. BlackRock took over all the domestic money, and China became the manufacturing base and the fuel and energy of all of the system. And so if you want to change the order, you say Israel is a node for MIC, and the strategic tension with Iran is what fuels the forever war. China came along and said, hey, in 2023, Saudi, Iran, I'm your most important partner. You guys normalize. And guess what? We're going to regime change Israel. October the 7th happens. The resistance is no longer supported. We enter into a phase of war. And we have a different version of Iran, normalized with Saudi Arabia, that now needs to get rid of America. How do you do that? Get Iran to destroy all the US bases. Get Israel to take out the people that weren't involved in this, that wouldn't be on board with this plan, and get America to destroy all the bases that need to be rebuilt by China and the Gulf countries. And then reset the world order by closing the Strait of Hormuz. How do you close the Strait of Hormuz? You do a two-way blockade that requires insurance through Lloyd's of London in order to get a ship through. So now you've got Lloyd's of London, America, and IRGC that determine whether you can get a ship through. And only China can resist that. So China gets all its energy. And guess what China did way before this? They built the largest oil reserves in the world, 1.6 million barrels. And if you look at the history and the syntax, you had the CIA escalate the Ukraine war, which was a regime change to install Zelensky. Then you had Russia take over Ukraine and BlackRock get the rest of the world using the IMF and the British pound as the collateral. Then you did Venezuela. Then you did Syria. Now, isn't it interesting that Russia and Iran and China miraculously allowed regime change to happen in Syria with the Assad regime and regime change to happen in Venezuela with Maduro? It's almost as if a group said, or a world leader said, the Middle East is now no longer for the forever war. And we're going to rebuild it with Gulf capital and Chinese capital. And you need to expel America and Iran and Saudi. You're going to be strategically, we don't need the strategic tension anymore. So let's regime change Israel. Let's get the media machine through Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Nick Fuentes to reveal Israel for what it actually is so that we can de-radicalize the evangelical Christians and radical Zionists in America destroy the reputation of Israel and acquire it. And Netanyahu started privatizing many of the Israeli state assets, and UAE started buying them. And what did UAE do? It got an FX swap line to take over the petrodollar. And it also came out of OPEC, which was the other half of the petrodollar. So the FIC handed over a node of this infrastructure. And what did Japan do? Japan started breaking the Japan carry trade and started increasing its interest rates. And then you had enemies between Europe and America, and manufactured, we're the socialists, in Europe, we're the capitalists, right? An energy crisis that made Europe more dependent. And the Western Hemisphere became subordinate to FIC through these operations. Russia gets Ukraine and China gets Taiwan as an alternative for World War III. So now we need a narrative. What's the narrative? Let's close the Strait of Hormuz. Let's make it where America can't defend it. And Trump creates an energy repricing crisis and inflation crisis that means the FIC kicks ass. And the FIC did kick ass, by the way. BlackRock's assets under administration went from 12 trillion to 14 trillion. Thank you very much. Beautiful, beautiful reset of the world order. America is being asset stripped. Europe is being vassalized into the FIC, tick, and mick. And the forever warmer can no longer be sustained because China has turned the Middle East back into West Asia. And the rebuild contracts will tell you whether that's true or not.
But you don't position yourself to benefit. You don't make investments on your analysis, do you?
There's two ways that you can take this. One is you try and build as much wealth in the game, knowing that you can cleanse the money into assets that sit outside the game.
Yeah.
And so I made a lot of money in the game. My game was private equity.
Yeah.
And once I figured out how the game was, I de-invested to the extent that I could. And I took my economic and financial energy outside of the game. I recognize that that's not a viable thing for most people. Most people have to have a mortgage. They have to have someone manage their money. And so there is a spectrum, as I said. I was blessed to the point where I think that money has energy. And I think energy and morality comes from intent. Right. And I think once you understand the game, you have a choice. You either contribute to the game and try and take your economic energy out, which is a genuine thing. It's a dilemma. There's no real answer here. Mm. Or you boycott the game and recognize that you have to take significantly more risk and build all your energy, monetary energy outside of the game. And the only games that I know outside the game are cash, gold, and Bitcoin in self-custody. That's higher risk. And practicality means that you have to do that. So in the end, what does it come down to me? It comes down to an intent of how you play this game and what you do. And I just personally believe that life is a test. And if you pass that test, you get more good. If you fail that test, you get more evil. And what we've learned is that financial success can turn you into the most subordinate, degenerate, high net worth, worst version of yourself. Or you can be someone completely broke that doesn't know the game and is the vast majority on a universal basic income. Or you can try and play the game better and end up with wealth outside the system and as many freedoms as you can possibly maintain. And I think that's your test. And how you decide will reward you depending on your spiritual belief around what the punishment is. And I'm not here to tell you what your belief is. I just know what mine is.
And the story you told at the beginning about your dad was, he must be very happy with the way you've gone, the way it turned out.
I'll close it here. So my father passed away on June the 12th, 2022. I lost both of my parents, in my belief, due to the conditioning that they followed in terms of what they did after COVID. I'll
Yeah.
leave it there. But they
I
were
hear you.
elderly. That's just my view. I can't prove it. But on June the 12th, 2022, my father passed away. And the reason I know that date beyond the death is because I invested in a company called Celsius. I was a shareholder in a company. And what they did is they allowed you to borrow against your Bitcoin and get a loan. And I decided to borrow against my Bitcoin with a small percentage of it to get a loan to experiment. That Bitcoin made me the 7th largest creditor of 650,000 in the bankruptcy case. And I spent 2.5 years fighting it. It turned out that there were many connections to Israel in that Celsius operation. And even some of the hacks that happened via a company called Bancor Dow, whose shareholders were the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. The co-founder has an AI startup with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel today. His wife, the VP of Loans, works as head of social media, or I call propaganda, for the IDF. I didn't know any of this stuff. Alex Majinsky is now in prison, and he was around an IDF member during the Lebanon war, where Hezbollah was formed from the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, something we're still going through today. But anyway, that day, they locked out billions and billions of dollars. Some people had their lifetime savings in there because Majinsky persuaded them to do it and said it was safe. I knew people that committed suicide because of that financial decision, because they couldn't face their family and tell them that they lost everything. And so they took their life. I know people that had to come out of retirement at age 80 because they didn't have an alternative plan. I met people there was one person on an ex-base that tried to persuade me because he sent me a picture of his child and said, look, this is my child, but I can't face this. I don't think I can bring him up anymore. Tell me why I shouldn't take myself right now. And I had to persuade him not to do it. I met people that moved to Central and South America because they could no longer afford to live in America because they lost their entire savings in this whole thing. And I was blessed because my father ended up on a pension and lost all his savings. And it was only because I answered his question that I was able to actually afford to look after him. And there were so many pensioners that lost their money. So the day that he passed away was the day that pensioners got locked out of their money. And I feel like there was some kind of messaging in there. And I was able to work for 2.5 years to recover as much money from that scam for as many victims as possible, as well as myself. And so, but I think that's the reason, my dad left me, because that closed the journey.
Yeah.
And that's how I choose to interpret it, whether it's true or not.
Well done. Next time we do a podcast, I'll tell you the story about my little brother, because it's actually very similar to yours. So I won't tell you this time. It's been great talking to you, Simon. How do people, where do we sort of read about you, read your stuff? You got a website? What?
Yeah, so I mainly have 3 things. So I give real-time commentary on X at Simon Dixon Twit. That's where I hang out the most to give real-time analysis. I've got a YouTube channel at Simon Dixon 21, where I go live every Friday. No sponsorship, nothing. Like, I'm not at that stage in life. No monetization, no ads, anything. And I just go through the week as a discipline, where I go through, try and make some predictions around what happened, follow the monetary flows each week in tech, macro, geopolitics, and I just publish it every Friday. And then if I get taken out from any of those places, I back everything up at simondixon.com. And I feed it into AI so that people, rather than listening to 4 hours, they can get a 10-minute overview or a 15-minute blog or a 30-minute video. So that if you don't have time, you can listen to it on simondixon.com.
Simon Dixon, thank you very much. And my dear beloved listeners and viewers, thank you for watching me. I really appreciate it. I love you all, but I especially love the ones who make the extra effort and become paid subscribers, which you can do at my website, jamesdelingpole.co.uk, or you can go the Substack route. I'm suspicious of Substack, but I see why it's quite it functions quite well for interactions, so that makes sense. But buy me a coffee. That's always nice. But yeah, keep listening, spread the word. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Simon Dixon.
Okay, thanks for having me.
There is now a new, better way of supporting me. If you want to, you can now subscribe direct at jamesdelingpole.co.uk. It's now got new features where you can subscribe directly to me. You get access to all my old archive material. You get my podcasts as they come out. And you can comment on the podcasts, and you can communicate with me probably more directly than you can elsewhere. I think it's probably the best way forward. Also, it obviates the risk of my being suddenly randomly closed down by some of these other websites. I mean, they're not our friends. So if you want to support me direct, go to jamesdelingpole.co.uk and sign up there. Without your support, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. So thank you.
Support ridiculously honest, no holds barred, independent truth-seeking at jamesdelingpole.co.uk. The Delingpole is produced by Wolfish Limited. Guests are very kindly booked by the lovely Venetia. The show is edited by Andrew Warwick, with animation by Warwick A.